In the sprawling expanse of Horizon Base, a bustling human outpost on the outer rim of a colonized planet, life moved with a rhythm as mechanical as the technology surrounding it. The base was a patchwork of cultures and species, each carving out a piece of life among the steel corridors, domed habitats, and docking bays. Humans and aliens moved side by side, yet often remained in separate worlds, connected by transactions but isolated in spirit. Kai, a curious 7-year-old human, wandered through the base with wide, observant eyes. For him, Horizon Base was an endless playground of mystery, and each day offered new sights. While most residents walked with purpose, heads down, minds preoccupied with duties or orders, Kai saw every detail. Where others saw routine, Kai saw stories. The echoes of conversations, the scratch of machinery, and the hum of lights formed a symphony that played just for him. Despite his fascination with Horizon Base's mechanics and alien inhabitants, Kai often found himself alone. The adults were always busy or simply unwilling to entertain the musings of a child. In Kai's world, questions about distant galaxies, strange customs, and unfamiliar faces swirled, unanswered. And so, he filled the gaps with his imagination, wandering deeper into the areas where adults rarely lingered, eager to learn on his own. One afternoon, as he explored an unused corridor near the storage docks, Kai stumbled upon something peculiar. In the shadows cast by the dim flickering lights, a large solitary figure sat slumped against the wall. Kai froze, his heart skipping a beat. It was one of the Zarvii, a race rarely spoken about and even less often interacted with. The Zarvii were known to be quiet, detached beings who kept mostly to themselves, their lives intertwined in mysterious customs. Their towering, powerful forms and dark, impassive faces left many humans uneasy. Kai observed the alien in silence, noticing details others might overlook. The Zarvi's dark, armor-like skin was rough and mottled with patches of dull, silvery scales. A row of sharp, jutting ridges ran along the top of its head, tapering off near its shoulders. But something about this Zarvi was different. It wasn't the usual imposing stance or guarded expression. No, this alien looked tired. Its shoulders were hunched and it leaned heavily against the wall, eyes half closed, almost as if in pain. Kai stepped forward, curiosity pushing away his initial hesitation. He was close enough now to see subtle tremors in the Zarvi's hand, which rested over a part of its torso, fingers clenched slightly. A faint, rhythmic pulse of light under its skin caught Kai's eye, a dim red glow that seemed to pulse slower than the alien's breathing, like a fading ember. Was it hurt? He couldn't tell, but the way it held itself reminded him of his father's old injuries, the way he would sit quietly and clench his jaw when his leg ached after a long day's work. The Zarvi's eyes flickered open, catching sight of Kai. The boy froze, heart thumping in his chest. The alien's gaze was piercing, two dark, reflective eyes narrowing on the small human before them. Kai's instinct was to run. Every story he'd ever heard about the Zarvi warned that they preferred their solitude and reacted poorly to intrusions. But something in the alien's gaze wasn't anger. If anything, it looked resigned, as if it had expected to be left alone but didn't have the energy to protest his presence. Summoning his courage, Kai stepped closer, carefully keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. The Zarvi's gaze followed his every step, but it didn't move or make a sound. Kai paused a few feet away and offered a gentle smile. "Are you okay?" he whispered, not expecting a response but wanting to show kindness. The Zarvi did not reply, only looked away, gaze lowering back to its hand resting against its torso. Kai felt a pang of sadness for the creature, realizing that it probably couldn't understand him, or perhaps chose not to. But the way it sat, isolated and silent, reminded him of how he felt sometimes, watching others walk by, too preoccupied to notice him. Over the next few minutes, Kai tried his best to show he meant no harm, giving a small wave and even sitting down cross-legged on the floor, still at a respectful distance. He began to speak softly, sharing bits and pieces of his day, filling the silence with his thoughts, hoping the alien might find some comfort in hearing a voice, even if it didn't understand. He told it about how he loved watching the stars at night, how they made him feel both small and important. He told it about the odd shapes he'd seen in the clouds that morning, wondering aloud if the Zarvi's planet had clouds too. The Zarvi didn't respond but seemed calmer, its breathing slower, less strained. The pulsing light under its skin flickered a little brighter, steadying, as though his presence had somehow lessened its burden. Kai felt a strange sense of accomplishment, a quiet victory in this silent connection. As the base's overhead lights dimmed, signaling the evening cycle, Kai knew he had to leave. He rose slowly, brushing the dust off his pants and giving the Zarvi one last look. "I'll come back tomorrow," he promised softly, not knowing if the alien understood or even cared. Still, it felt like the right thing to say. When he returned to his quarters that night, his mind raced with thoughts of the Zarvi. He wondered if it was hurt, if anyone else cared, or if he was the only one who had noticed. The adults always warned him about being too curious, but something about the alien's silent, haunted gaze stayed with him, tugging at his heart. He decided that, no matter what, he would go back. He would be there for it, even if no one else was willing to. In the quiet of his bunk, Kai made a silent promise to the Zarvi, to himself, and to the universe that stretched beyond Horizon Base. No one deserved to suffer alone. The next day, Kai couldn't shake the image of the Zarvi from his mind. While his classmates learned about planetary navigation and his teachers lectured on intergalactic history, he was distracted by thoughts of the alien in the shadows, its slumped posture and tired gaze. He wondered if it was still there, leaning against the cold wall, with no one to see or care. The mystery gnawed at him. As soon as the day's lessons ended, Kai slipped away, heart racing as he made his way back to the corridor near the storage docks. When he arrived, he found the Zarvi exactly where he'd left it, motionless except for the slow rise and fall of its chest. Kai noticed how it held the same spot on its torso, its fingers tense as if protecting a hidden wound. The dim pulse of light beneath its skin had dulled again, almost fading into the dark gray of its scales. He moved cautiously, his footsteps soft as he approached, wary of startling the alien. The Zarvi's head turned slightly, its dark eyes fixing on him. Kai stopped, hands raised in what he hoped was a reassuring gesture. "It's just me," he murmured, barely above a whisper. He wanted to comfort it, to let it know he wasn't a threat. Something about its presence filled him with both awe and an unexplainable sadness. Kai hesitated for a moment before taking another small step forward. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a packet of dried fruit, one of his favorite snacks which he'd saved especially for this visit. Slowly, he stretched out his hand, holding the packet toward the alien. The Zarvi watched him, gaze flickering from his face to the offering. It didn't move, only continued its silent observation. Kai felt his heart pounding, unsure if the alien even recognized his gesture as friendly. But just as he was about to pull his hand back, the Zarvi extended its long, rough fingers, gently taking the packet from his hand. Kai couldn't help but smile. It was the first time the Zarvi had acknowledged him directly. The alien held the packet delicately, examining it with a strange mix of caution and curiosity, as if the small offering carried a significance beyond its simple form. It raised the packet to its face, inhaling the faint scent, and a glint of recognition crossed its gaze. Carefully, it tore open the packet and took a small bite, its movements deliberate and slow. Kai watched in silence, heart swelling with a mix of relief and satisfaction. Encouraged by this breakthrough, Kai decided to try talking again. "I'm Kai," he said softly, placing a hand on his chest as he spoke his name. Then he pointed toward the Zarvi, hoping the alien might understand he was asking for its name. The Zarvi tilted its head slightly, its expression unreadable. It didn't respond, and Kai wondered if his attempt had failed. But then, after a few moments of silence, the Zarvi raised a hand to its own chest and tapped twice, a gesture that seemed both familiar and foreign. Kai wasn't sure what it meant, but he sensed it was the closest he'd come to a response. Kai let the silence stretch, feeling a quiet understanding building between them. He studied the Zarvi more closely now, noticing the intricate patterns along its arm, like scars or markings etched deep into its skin. He wanted to reach out and examine them, but he held back, sensing that he should be respectful of the Zarvi's boundaries. As the silence settled, Kai noticed the way the alien's hand still lingered over the injury on its torso. He remembered how his father had used an ointment to ease his own pain after a long day. Tentatively, he pointed to the spot on the Zarvi's torso and asked, "Does it hurt?" The Zarvi's gaze met his again, a flicker of understanding passing between them. It slowly lowered its hand, revealing the area Kai had been curious about. Beneath the rough, mottled scales was a large, dark bruise, tinged with a sickly green hue that pulsed faintly. The sight made Kai's heart twist with sympathy. The alien had been suffering in silence, its pain unnoticed by everyone around it. Without thinking, Kai dug into his backpack and pulled out a small basic first aid kit he'd borrowed from the school's infirmary. It wasn't much, just bandages and antiseptic wipes, but he hoped it would help in some way. He held up the kit, showing the Zarvi his intentions, hoping it would allow him to help. To his surprise, the Zarvi didn't pull away. It watched him carefully, its eyes filled with a mix of wariness and curiosity. Taking this as permission, Kai opened the kit and took out an antiseptic wipe. He inched closer, holding the wipe near the bruised area, hesitating for a moment before gently dabbing at the wound. The Zarvi tensed slightly, but it didn't resist. Kai worked slowly, trying to be as gentle as possible. He could feel the alien's steady, controlled breathing beneath his fingertips, a rhythm that steadied his own nerves. The Zarvi's skin was warm and rough, yet oddly reassuring to touch. As he worked, Kai whispered to it, small, soothing words that he wasn't sure the alien could understand but hoped would offer comfort. When he finished, Kai placed a small bandage over the bruise, securing it with a tender pat. The Zarvi looked down at the bandage, its expression difficult to read, but Kai thought he saw a glimmer of gratitude in its eyes. It raised one hand and placed it on its chest, a slow, deliberate gesture that Kai sensed was a form of thanks. As Kai stepped back, he felt a new kind of connection forming between them, a fragile, unspoken bond born of compassion and trust. The Zarvi's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, Kai thought he saw a flicker of warmth in its dark eyes. Kai glanced at the time, realizing he'd have to leave soon. He stood, dusting off his hands, and gave the Zarvi a small smile. "I'll come back," he promised again, his voice filled with determination. This time he felt certain the alien understood him. As he walked away, Kai's heart felt lighter, his mind buzzing with the realization that he'd made a friend in the most unexpected of places. The Zarvi's silent presence, once intimidating, had become a source of comfort and curiosity. The thought of returning the next day filled him with a quiet joy, a feeling that perhaps he was doing something that mattered. That night, as Kai lay in bed, he thought about the Zarvi's gesture of thanks and the silent understanding they had shared. It was a connection beyond words, something deeper than language. The following days passed with Kai slipping away to visit the Zarvi in the deserted corridor. Each time he brought something new, perhaps a bit of food, a small toy, or a handful of colored stones he'd collected from around Horizon Base. These small offerings were his way of expressing care, bridging the silent gap between him and the alien who had no voice but spoke volumes through every subtle shift in its gaze, each small gesture of acknowledgement. Yet, even as Kai's bond with the Zarvi grew, his secret visits did not go unnoticed. His absence during communal meals and his wandering habits began to draw questions from the adults around him. One evening, just after he'd returned from seeing the Zarvi, his older sister Mira caught him slipping through the base's back corridor. She crossed her arms, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Kai, where have you been?" she asked, her tone gentle but probing. "I've seen you sneaking off. What are you up to?" Kai hesitated. He trusted Mira, but he wasn't sure she would understand. He feared that if anyone knew about his visits to the Zarvi, they would force him to stop. Still, Mira's gaze was steady, and he could see the worry in her eyes. After a moment of silence, he decided to tell her, though carefully. "I've been visiting a friend," he said, choosing his words slowly. "Someone who needs help." Mira's brow furrowed, her curiosity clearly piqued. "A friend? Out there?" She glanced toward the dimly lit corridors, a slight frown forming on her face. "Who are you talking about, Kai?" Swallowing nervously, Kai finally whispered, "It's a Zarvi. I think he's hurt." At the mention of the alien species, Mira's expression shifted to one of alarm. "A Zarvi. Kai, you know what they say about them. They're not like us. They're different." Her voice lowered, as if just mentioning them could bring danger upon them. Kai felt a pang of frustration. "But he's alone and in pain, Mira. No one even looks at him. He's not scary or dangerous. He just needs someone." Mira shook her head, her expression softening but tinged with caution. "Kai, the adults have warned us for a reason. The Zarvi don't communicate the way we do. They don't get close to humans. They don't even want to. You might be misinterpreting things. What if he gets angry? What if he hurts you?" Kai's resolve hardened. He looked into his sister's eyes, his voice firm. "He wouldn't. I know he wouldn't. And if no one else cares, I do. I can't just leave him there." Seeing the determination in his eyes, Mira sighed, finally relenting. "Just be careful, okay? And don't tell anyone else, they won't understand." Over the next few days, Kai continued his visits, but now he was aware of the adults' cautious glances, their sidelong whispers. He overheard them speaking about the Zarvi with distrust. To them, the alien species represented an enigma, a reminder of past encounters fraught with misunderstandings and distance. Some adults still saw the Zarvi as intimidating and unreachable, clinging to rumors and prejudice rather than looking beyond them. One afternoon, as Kai made his way to the storage docks, he overheard two adults talking nearby. They stood at a corner, voices lowered yet still audible. I saw that Zarvi near the outer docks again. Can't imagine what it's doing there every day, lurking in the shadows like that, one of them muttered. Honestly, they're better left alone, replied the other. Zarvi don't mix well with humans. They're too closed off, too alien. You can never tell what they're thinking. The words made Kai's heart sink. No one cared to see the Zarvi's pain. They only saw an outsider, an alien who didn't fit into their world. Frustrated, Kai felt a rush of anger mixed with sadness. They didn't understand. They couldn't see the Zarvi's vulnerability, or the quiet strength beneath its stoic exterior. All they saw was what they wanted to believe, a creature too different, too distant to matter. Determined to help his friend, Kai snuck into the storage bay that night, searching for anything that could help ease the Zarvi's pain. He found a small container of ointment and some fresh bandages from the supply cabinet. Clutching the items to his chest, he returned to the alien, whose faint glow in the dim corridor felt like a beacon guiding him through the darkness. When he reached the Zarvi, Kai knelt beside it, holding up the ointment. I brought something to help, he whispered, voice soft but filled with determination. The Zarvi gazed at him, its dark eyes reflecting both surprise and something softer, an understanding that Kai's presence, his offerings, were acts of kindness. Tentatively, it leaned forward, allowing Kai to apply the ointment to its wound. Kai worked in silence, hands gentle and careful, focusing on each movement. He felt the Zarvi's steady breath beneath his hands, its calm presence reassuring him that he was doing the right thing. As he applied the last bandage, Kai spoke softly. You know, people here, they think you're scary, but you're not. I know that. His words were a whisper, a confession to his silent friend. They don't see you like I do. The Zarvi turned its gaze toward him, and for the first time, Kai thought he saw something break in its expression, a flicker of sadness, a hint of loneliness that mirrored his own. It reached out one large hand, placing it gently on Kai's shoulder in what felt like a gesture of gratitude, a quiet acknowledgement of their bond. They stayed like that for a few moments in the silence of mutual understanding, two souls finding solace in the simplest act of compassion. But the peace didn't last. Just as Kai was about to gather his things, a faint voice echoed down the corridor. Who's there? Kai's heart stopped. He recognized the voice. Mr. Terran, one of the security officers who patrolled the storage docks. Panic surged through him, and he glanced at the Zarvi, whose gaze had shifted, alert and tense. Mr. Terran's footsteps grew closer, echoing off the metal walls. Kai held his breath, his mind racing. If the officer found them, he'd surely report Kai's actions to the council, and they'd never allow him to see the Zarvi again. Desperately, Kai whispered, "Hide!" The Zarvi's gaze flickered to him, understanding his urgency. With surprising agility, it shifted into the shadows, blending seamlessly into the darkened corner of the corridor. Kai, meanwhile, pressed himself against the wall, his heart pounding. Mr. Terran's flashlight beam swept over the corridor, pausing just inches from where Kai hid. He held his breath, frozen, hoping his presence would go unnoticed. After a tense moment, the footsteps faded and the light receded. Kai exhaled, relief flooding him as he turned back to the Zarvi, who had emerged from the shadows, watching him with a silent, steady gaze. Kai managed a small, shaky smile. "I'll come back tomorrow," he promised, his voice a whisper of determination. And this time, he meant it more than ever. Kai could barely sleep that night, his mind filled with images of the Zarvi hiding in the shadows, vulnerable and alone. Despite the dangers, he felt more determined than ever. There was something special in his bond with the alien, something no one else could understand. The Zarvi's gaze, heavy with unspoken words, seemed to linger in his thoughts. He knew he had to continue visiting, even if it meant keeping this friendship secret from everyone else. The next afternoon, Kai returned to the corridor, carrying his usual supplies along with a small flashlight and a notebook. His curiosity about the Zarvi's life and the source of its pain had only grown, and he hoped to find some way to communicate better, to understand more of his friend's world. When he reached the quiet corner, the Zarvi was already waiting, its dark eyes catching the light as he approached. It seemed to expect him now, a subtle shift in their relationship that made Kai's heart warm with an unexpected joy. He sat down beside the Zarvi, close but not too close, respecting the alien's boundaries as he always did. After a few minutes of silence, he opened his notebook, holding it up so the Zarvi could see. With a pencil in hand, Kai drew a rough sketch of himself and pointed to his chest. "Kai," he said, tapping his chest for emphasis. Then he pointed to the Zarvi, an invitation for it to share its name, or something similar. The Zarvi tilted its head, a curious glint in its eyes. It paused as if contemplating the request, and then reached out with one long finger. It pointed to a particular pattern on its own arm, a series of interlocking marks that looked almost like a constellation, etched deeply into its rough skin. Kai leaned closer, studying the intricate design. Was this its name, its identity? Kai wasn't sure, but he gave a nod, respecting whatever meaning the marks held. Wanting to learn more, Kai decided to take a risk. He carefully pointed to the bruise on the Zarvi's torso, and then mimicked a look of pain, hoping it would understand that he wanted to know how it had been injured. To his surprise, the Zarvi's gaze softened, a flicker of sorrow passing over its face. Slowly, the Zarvi raised its other hand and traced a series of lines in the dust on the floor, as though telling a story through symbols. Kai watched, captivated, as shapes began to emerge, a large figure surrounded by smaller ones, an arrow piercing through one of the smaller figures, and then a tall structure with jagged lines surrounding it. Kai felt a pang of empathy as he interpreted what the Zarvi was trying to convey, a moment of violence, a place of danger and loss. The Zarvi paused after the drawing, its hand hovering over the symbols as though the memories weighed heavily on it. Kai could see the grief in its posture, a deep sadness that was both personal and profound. The alien's stoic exterior hid a pain that no one else on the base had bothered to acknowledge. Gently, Kai placed his small hand over one of the symbols, looking up at the Zarvi with a quiet understanding. "I'm sorry," he whispered, hoping the alien could feel his compassion, even if it didn't understand the words. He wished he could do more, but this simple act of empathy was all he had to offer. In response, the Zarvi looked at him with an intensity he hadn't seen before. It lifted one of its long fingers and, with surprising tenderness, touched the back of Kai's hand, a gesture that felt like an acknowledgement of his kindness. For a moment they sat together in silence, two beings from vastly different worlds united by shared empathy. Wanting to lighten the mood, Kai opened his backpack and pulled out a small round trinket, a worn-out compass he'd found in the base's recycling center. The needle no longer pointed north, but it spun freely whenever it was shaken, creating a mesmerizing effect. Kai held it out to the Zarvi, grinning as he showed off how the needle spun with each movement. The alien watched with interest, its gaze following the compass as Kai shook it again. Slowly, the Zarvi extended a hand, and Kai placed the compass in its palm. The alien's fingers closed around it, and a faint smile tugged at the corners of its mouth, a subtle expression, but one that filled Kai with happiness. It was the first time he'd seen the Zarvi show anything close to joy, and the sight made him feel like he'd just uncovered a hidden treasure. Feeling emboldened, Kai decided to ask a question that had been on his mind. He pointed to the Zarvi, then gestured around them, indicating the base and the people within it. "Why do they not talk to you?" he asked softly, trying to convey the question with his hands and expression. The Zarvi's face shifted, its eyes growing distant as it considered the question. Finally, it tapped its chest in a slow, deliberate rhythm, then gestured outward, as if signaling a separation, a wall. Kai understood. It was the barrier that others had placed around it, an invisible line that kept it isolated. The Zarvi's silence wasn't its choice. It was forced upon it by the unspoken prejudice and misunderstanding from those around it. Kai felt a surge of anger mixed with sadness. How unfair it was that this creature, who had shown him nothing but gentleness, was left to suffer in silence simply because of others' fears and assumptions. Determined to change that, if only in a small way, Kai held out his hand again. This time, the Zarvi took it without hesitation, their fingers interlacing in a quiet gesture of solidarity. From that moment, their bond deepened. Each visit, Kai noticed the Zarvi's posture relaxing a little more, its gaze softening whenever he arrived. It was as though his presence alone was a balm, a quiet reminder that it wasn't as alone as it had believed. And as Kai continued bringing small gifts, telling stories of his own life, and sitting with the Zarvi in comfortable silence, he could feel the alien opening up in return. Sometimes it would trace more symbols in the dust, depicting scenes of a life before the pain, memories of a world far from here. Kai would listen, nodding along, even if he couldn't fully understand. Just being there, acknowledging the Zarvi's stories, seemed to bring them both a measure of peace. By the end of each visit, Kai always felt a renewed sense of purpose. He didn't need to understand every word or gesture. He only needed to be there, to share in the quiet companionship they had formed. As he left that day, he looked back at the Zarvi, feeling a deep gratitude for the strange friendship they had created, one that defied language and culture, but thrived on trust and empathy. He knew, without a doubt, that he would continue visiting no matter what others thought. In his heart, he had come to see the Zarvi not just as a strange creature but as a friend who had opened a window into another world, one filled with unspoken stories and the silent strength to endure. As days passed, Kai's visits to the Zarvi became the most cherished part of his routine. Each day brought new stories, gestures, and unspoken understanding between them. Kai marveled at how their bond had grown, filling a void he hadn't known existed, and yet, a lingering worry gnawed at him. The secrecy of their friendship, the constant caution, it all felt fragile, as though one wrong step could shatter everything they had built. One afternoon, Kai made his way through the winding corridors with his usual supplies. He'd brought an old, battered book on Earth's natural wonders, a gift for the Zarvi, hoping it would enjoy seeing the images of lush forests, towering mountains, and endless oceans. But as he neared their meeting spot, he heard voices coming from down the corridor. He stopped, heart pounding, recognizing the voices. It was Mr. Terran, the security officer, speaking with another adult. Kai pressed himself against the cold metal wall, straining to hear. "That Zarvi's been lurking around here too often," Mr. Terran was saying, his voice laced with suspicion. "Makes me uneasy. We've tolerated their presence, but they keep to themselves for a reason. I don't like seeing them near the storage areas. And now I hear they've been seen interacting with someone." The other adult muttered in agreement. "They're not like us. Who knows what they're planning? And if it's getting friendly with a human, that's even more concerning." Kai's stomach twisted as he realized they were talking about him, though they didn't know it. He clenched his fists, anger flaring at their words. They didn't understand the Zarvi at all. They didn't see its kindness, its silent pain, or the way it had opened up to him. To them, the Zarvi was just another faceless alien, a potential threat to be wary of. "Keep an eye out," Mr. Terran continued. "We'll need to separate them if we catch anyone getting too close. It's for their safety. And ours." Kai's heart sank. If they discovered his friendship with the Zarvi, they would tear them apart, forbidding any future contact. He couldn't let that happen. This connection, this friendship, had become too important to him. He would do anything to protect it. When the voices finally faded down the corridor, Kai took a shaky breath, feeling the weight of his decision. He'd have to be even more careful from now on, avoiding Mr. Terran's watchful eyes and sticking to less traveled routes. But that night, he lay awake in his bed, feeling the first tremors of doubt. Would he really be able to keep this friendship hidden forever? What would happen if he couldn't? The next evening, Kai approached their meeting spot with extra caution. The Zarvi was there, as always, its gaze lighting up faintly as he appeared. Kai offered a small smile, though the worry still churned in his chest. He didn't want to alarm his friend, but the tension was hard to hide. He handed the Zarvi the book on Earth's wonders, and as he watched the alien carefully flip through the pages, an idea struck him. Perhaps he could warn the Zarvi, find a way to explain the danger they were in. Even if they couldn't communicate in full sentences, he could try to make it understand that others were watching, that they needed to be cautious. Taking a deep breath, Kai pointed to himself, then gestured toward the corridor where he'd heard Mr. Terran's voice. He mimicked an expression of fear, hoping the Zarvi would grasp his meaning. The alien watched him closely, its expression shifting as it followed his gestures. Then Kai pointed to it, placing his hands in front of himself like a barrier, showing how they might be forced apart. The Zarvi's eyes darkened, a faint glow flickering across its scales. It understood enough. Kai could see the worry in its gaze. There was a tension now that hadn't existed before, a sense that their fragile friendship was under threat. In a gesture of reassurance, the Zarvi reached out, placing a hand gently on Kai's shoulder. The touch was warm, grounding, and filled with a silent promise that they would face whatever came together. Kai placed his hand over the Zarvi's, feeling a renewed determination. But just as they shared this moment, a sudden noise echoed down the corridor, the unmistakable clanking of boots on metal. Kai's heart raced. Someone was coming. Without thinking, he grabbed the Zarvi's hand, pulling it toward the shadows of a nearby alcove. The alien moved swiftly, silent and graceful, blending into the darkness with Kai pressed close beside it. They held their breath as the footsteps drew nearer. "Who's there?" Mr. Terran's voice called out, sharp and suspicious. He shone a flashlight down the corridor, the beam cutting through the dimness, searching for any sign of movement. Kai's heart hammered in his chest as he pressed himself against the wall, the Zarvi's hand still clutched tightly in his own. He could feel the warmth of the alien's presence beside him, a steadying force amidst the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. They stood motionless, silent, hoping Mr. Terran would pass them by. The flashlight beam swept past, pausing only inches from their hiding spot before moving on. Finally, After what felt like an eternity, Mr. Terran's footsteps receded down the hall, and the corridor fell back into quiet. Kai let out a shaky breath, releasing the Zarvi's hand. He looked up, meeting his friend's gaze, both of them sharing a moment of relief mixed with lingering tension. The danger was more real now than ever. They had barely escaped, and the close call left them both on edge. With a renewed urgency, Kai faced the Zarvi, pointing to his chest and then gesturing toward the rest of the base. "I can't lose you," he whispered, knowing the Zarvi wouldn't understand the exact words, but hoping the emotion was clear. "They don't see you like I do, but I'm not giving up." The Zarvi reached out again, its hand resting on Kai's shoulder, a silent reassurance. In that touch, Kai felt the strength and resilience that had carried his friend through so much pain and isolation. The Zarvi had endured alone for so long, and Kai knew now that he couldn't let it return to that life of solitude, not when they'd come so far together. Determined to do whatever it took to protect their friendship, Kai took a step back, placing his hand over his heart as he looked at the Zarvi. "I'll come back," he promised, voice steady despite the fear that gripped him, "and we'll find a way to keep this safe." The Zarvi nodded, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement, but Kai understood. They would continue, despite the risks. Their bond had grown too strong to be broken by fear alone. As Kai slipped away that night, he felt the weight of the days to come. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with potential dangers and eyes that would judge without understanding. But with each step, he felt a fierce resolve burning inside him. He would protect his friend, no matter the cost. In his heart, he knew this friendship was worth fighting for, and as long as the Zarvi stood by him, Kai would stand against any prejudice or barrier that tried to tear them apart. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, bound by a trust that transcended words, strengthened by a friendship that had already withstood so much. The following days were tense, with Kai and the Zarvi meeting under constant watchfulness and caution. Every footstep, every passing shadow felt like a threat that could separate them forever. But their bond had only deepened. Each shared silence and quiet exchange, adding layers of understanding and mutual care. Kai was determined to find a way to make others see the Zarvi as he did, a friend, not a stranger. One afternoon, Kai noticed the Zarvi's injury was healing. The bruise had faded, the glow under its skin growing steady and strong again. Despite the dangers, seeing his friend's health improve filled Kai with a sense of triumph. His care had made a difference, and perhaps he thought this could be proof that his friend was not the creature of cold detachment that others assumed. But fate didn't wait long to test their bond. One evening, as Kai was leaving the Zarvi's side, he rounded the corner and found himself face to face with Mr. Terran. The officer's eyes widened, then narrowed, suspicion hardening into anger as he glanced between Kai and the dark corridor where the Zarvi waited out of sight. "What are you doing here, boy?" Mr. Terran's voice was sharp, accusatory. He stepped closer, his gaze hard and unforgiving. "I knew someone was sneaking around, but I didn't expect it to be you." Kai felt his heart pounding, fear rising like a tidal wave, but he held his ground, lifting his chin defiantly. I was just checking on a friend." "Friend?" Mr. Terran's tone was incredulous. "A friend?" He pointed down the corridor, his eyes darkening. "Are you telling me you've been talking to that creature?" Kai's face flushed with a mixture of fear and anger. "He's not a creature," he said, his voice steady despite the quiver in his hands. "He's hurt. He was alone and no one cared, but I do." Mr. Terran looked ready to argue, but then the Zarvi stepped out from the shadows, tall and silent, its dark eyes focused on Mr. Terran. The officer froze, a flicker of unease crossing his face. The Zarvi's presence was commanding, a quiet power radiating from it, but Kai could see the calm, the lack of threat in his friend's eyes. In that moment, Kai felt a surge of courage. "He was injured, and I helped him," Kai explained, his voice rising with conviction. "Just because he's different doesn't mean he doesn't feel pain or loneliness. He deserves to be treated like a friend." A few more people had gathered by then, drawn by the commotion. Adults muttered in hushed tones, exchanging wary glances, their fear and distrust thick in the air. But Kai didn't back down. He took a step forward, facing them all with a fierce determination. "He's shown me kindness," Kai said, his voice carrying over the quiet whispers. He could have hurt me, but he never did. All he needed was someone to see him, to care about his pain, just like any of us would. The Zarvi remained silent, watching Kai with a steady gaze. For a moment, it lifted a hand and placed it on Kai's shoulder, a simple, silent gesture of support. The people around them watched with a mixture of shock and curiosity, uncertain but unwilling to look away. Kai felt the warmth of his friend's hand, a grounding force that steadied his heart and strengthened his resolve. Mira, who had been drawn by the gathering crowd, stepped forward. She looked at Kai, then at the Zarvi, her face a mixture of concern and something else, an understanding that hadn't been there before. "Kai's right," she spoke up, her voice clear but calm. "We don't know much about the Zarvi, but that doesn't mean we should treat them as enemies. Maybe we should listen to Kai and see what he sees." A murmur ran through the crowd, some adults nodding while others crossed their arms skeptically. But Kai could sense a shift, a small crack in the wall of fear and suspicion that had kept them apart. Mr. Tarrant hesitated, his jaw clenched. "It's dangerous to trust them. You know nothing about them, about what they're capable of." Kai shook his head, determination filling his voice. "We'll never know if we keep pushing them away. He's been here all this time, alone, and no one bothered to ask why. But I did, and I found a friend." Silence settled over the group. The Zarvi lowered its hand, standing tall but calm, its gaze meeting Mr. Tarrant's with a quiet resilience. The crowd seemed unsure, caught between old fears and the compelling sight of Kai standing bravely beside this alien who, despite the fear it inspired, had shown no sign of aggression. After a long, tense pause, one of the older residents stepped forward, a woman with gentle eyes and a thoughtful expression. She looked between Kai and the Zarvi, then nodded slowly. "Perhaps Kai is right. Maybe it's time we start understanding instead of fearing." Her words seemed to break the tension, the murmurs around them softening. Kai felt a rush of relief as the crowd's suspicion began to shift, replaced by a hesitant curiosity. Over the following days, word of Kai's friendship with the Zarvi spread through Horizon Base. Some people remained wary, unable to shake their prejudice, but others grew more open, intrigued by Kai's courage and the bond he'd formed with the alien. A few even ventured to greet the Zarvi in passing, acknowledging its presence with respectful nods. The Zarvi's once isolated existence gradually changed, though it was still a creature of few words and quiet movements. Its connection with Kai had cracked the barrier of silence around it. Where once it had been alone, it now had allies, people who began to see it as more than just a strange, distant being. Kai's bond with the Zarvi remained strong, a friendship built on trust and kindness that transcended the differences between their worlds. They continued meeting, no longer in secret but openly, with Kai introducing his friend to small aspects of human life. A gift here, a story there. The Zarvi, in turn, shared more of its own past, its gestures and symbols slowly weaving together a tale of resilience and survival. One evening, as they sat together under the faint glow of the corridor lights, the Zarvi placed a small carved stone in Kai's hand, a simple object etched with the same constellation-like patterns that marked its skin. Kai understood it as a gift, a symbol of their friendship and all they had endured together. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. The Zarvi's gaze softened, and for the first time, Kai thought he saw a glimmer of contentment in its eyes. When they finally parted that night, Kai felt a profound sense of peace. He knew their friendship had made a difference, not only in his own life but in the hearts of those around them. The Zarvi was no longer an isolated figure, and Kai had shown his community that kindness could bridge even the vastest divides. As he walked away, he felt the weight of the carved stone in his hand, a reminder of the bond they'd forged, a bond that had transformed not only them, but everyone who had witnessed it. And as he looked back one last time, he saw the Zarvi watching him with a quiet pride, its dark eyes reflecting the light of a friendship that had, against all odds, brought two worlds closer together. In that moment, Kai knew that they had both found something precious, an understanding that would last, a connection that went beyond words. And in the silent depths of Horizon Base, a new chapter had begun, built on trust, compassion, and the simple, enduring strength of friendship.